Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for January 24, 2022, the funding was secured edition. And we continue our lead story comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, but it continues the salacious testimony of Elon Musk at his funding secured trial, as he claimed now that funding was secured. Well, that's certainly a turn of events. And that he now claims the Saudis promised him money, and then they later backed out. Of course, there's no documents to that effect. It's just a feeling, But it didn't really matter because he had enough money on his own. So the story continues to evolve. Next up, from the New York Times, Ukraine President Zelensky has vowed action against corruption after Minister of Defense is fired for alleged embezzlement. The Ukrainian leader said dismissal should serve notice to officials who violate the principles of justice. And he's vowed to take action against corruption in the wake of the official's dismissal. Corruption long plagued Ukraine before Russia invaded, and now all I can say is it's going to be Katie bar the door. Next up, from Bloomberg. How do you tell it's time for you to step down from your leadership role? In this article, Joe Constance explores that question in the context of New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and Netflix's Reed Hastings making headlines announcing they were stepping down. How do you as a leader really know when it's time to do so? And she poses some of the following questions. Is the job still a good fit? Are you burned out? Does your job get in the way of other goals? So it's interesting that she can use sort of these real-time events to get executives starting to think about this. And if you're a CCO, and you might want to just ask yourself some of these questions. And our final article or story today comes to us from Reuters, and it's a story about the U.S. Supreme Court that has dismissed an appeal it previously heard oral arguments on. And we previously reported on this case because it deals with the attorney-client privilege and a difference in the circuits on whether you use the primary purpose test or the dual purpose test to determine if something is an attorney-client privilege. So the primary purpose is that the primary purpose of the communications is to provide legal advice. The dual purpose test lowers that standard somewhat and says if a purpose of the communication was legal to provide legal advice, it can be protected. The Ninth Circuit upheld the attorney-client privilege based upon the dual purpose test, and now that has been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. So watch your privilege. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.